All right, ready to become a communication ninja. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the wild world of workplace dynamics. You sent us this source, 20 ways to communicate effectively. And wow, this thing is packed with strategies.
Oh yeah, it really dives into how we can navigate all those tricky personalities you find at work and just become a better communicator in general.
Yeah, it's not just about getting your point across, right? It's also about building trust and figuring out how to handle those situations that honestly make you want to just mute everyone.
Exactly, exactly. I think we've all been there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, with 20 strategies in this thing, where do we even start? What are the fundamentals we need to build on?
Well, the source kind of jumps right into a technique that, it sounds really simple, but it can make a huge difference, and that's switching from you statements to I statements.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about that. Why is that such a big deal? Doesn't it just sound like you're trying to shift the blame?
It's not really about blame. It's more about shifting the focus. Instead of pointing fingers, you're talking about how you feel. Like if someone says you're always late, immediately you get defensive, right?
Oh, for sure.
But if they say, I feel stressed when projects get delayed because of missed deadlines, it kind of opens the door to actually understanding each other.
Uh, so it's less about attacking and more about expressing how their actions impact you.
Yeah. And there's actual research behind this, studies on emotional intelligence. They show that when people feel like they're being heard, they're more open to feedback, even if it's something they don't want to hear.
That makes sense. It's like instead of being in attack mode, you're switching to problem-solving mode. I remember this one time, actually. Maybe that's a story for later. So what other foundational tips are in here?
Okay, here's one that might surprise you: the power of a well-timed apology. And this isn't about just admitting you were wrong. It's more about acknowledging the situation, and how it affected someone.
So it's not like I was wrong. It's more like, I'm sorry this happened. Let's figure this out together.
Yes, you got it. Think about it. When someone genuinely apologizes, even if they weren't totally at fault, it can, de-escalate things.
Right, right. It's like hitting the reset button. Yeah. And I can see how that could build trust over time.
Exactly. Exactly. And that actually ties into another big point the source talks about. Actions speak louder than words. You might be saying one thing, but your body language is telling a different story.
Oh, I know that one. It's like when someone says, I'm fine, but they're clearly not. Like their words say one thing, but their whole vibe says something else.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always that obvious either. Sometimes it's subtle stuff like eye contact or how you're standing, even mirroring someone's body language. It all affects how your message comes across.
So, if I want to build a good rapport with a colleague, I should mirror their body language. So if they lean forward, I should too.
You got it. Doing that subtly can actually create a sense of connection, make people feel more comfortable, but it has to be genuine. Like if it's forced, it'll have the opposite effect.
Right, right, makes sense. So, okay, we've got our foundation. Using I statements, apologizing strategically, and making sure our actions match our words. But what about when you're dealing with, those personalities, the ones that make those basic skills feel impossible?
Now that's where things get really interesting. The source goes deep on strategies for how to deal with those tricky coworkers. We all know them, the ones who just, you wonder if they learned to communicate on another planet.
Oh, yeah. I am so ready to unpack some of these personality types because I'm sure we've all encountered a few of these characters.
All right, let's start with the classic, the backstabber. That coworker who acts like your friend, but then, bam, they throw you under the bus.
Ugh, yes. You think you can trust them and then they totally sabotage you or steal your idea. So frustrating. How do you deal with that kind of, toxic behavior?
Well, the source says, instead of just letting that anger simmer, confront them directly but strategically. Don't just, march over there while you're still fuming.
So take a breath, let things cool down, and then what? Do I just, calmly call them a backstabber?
No, no. This is where those I statements are really helpful. You explain what you heard, how it made you feel, and then give them a chance to respond.
Okay, so I heard you said X about my project to Y, and it really hurt because I thought we were on the same team.
Exactly. You're not directly attacking them. You're just letting them know how their actions impacted you. It really puts the ball in their court. They either deny it and you can address that, or they might actually admit it and explain themselves.
Wow, that's pretty smart. Makes them accountable.
Right. And it shows you're not afraid to stand up for yourself. And remember, document everything. That way, if it keeps happening, you have a record of trying to address it.
That is a good tip, okay? I'm already feeling more prepared to deal with those backstabbers. What about credit stealers? The ones who just magically make your ideas their own.
Ah, yes. The master illusionists. The source says for this one, it's all about speaking up right away. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and your work.
So, if I'm in a meeting and someone starts presenting my idea as their own, I should just jump in and be like, actually, that was my idea. Here's how I came up with it.
Exactly. Be assertive, not aggressive.
Yeah.
You don't need to go on a rant. Just state the facts. Make sure everyone knows you contributed.
This is reminding me of this one time.
What's fascinating here is,
Oh man, it was awful. This colleague basically took my entire marketing campaign and presented it as their own. I was so shocked, I froze. I didn't say anything.
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, our first instinct is often to just freeze up. We're so caught off guard, we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to react quickly. Even if it's just something like, hey, I had a similar thought, mind if I share it too?
Right, right. Because if you wait too long, then it's even harder to, claim your work. It's like that awkward moment when someone tells a story about you and it's totally made up and you have to correct them.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. And speaking of awkward, let's talk about another personality that can really complicate things at work, the gossiper. That person who just lives for drama, always whispering secrets and stirring the pot.
Ugh, yeah, the office gossip. It's like they're a walking rumor mill, always creating tension. It's exhausting. What's the best way to deal with them?
The source has a really simple solution for this one. Don't engage. It's like a fire, right? A fire needs oxygen to burn. Gossipers need an audience.
So if they try to put me into a conversation about someone else, I should just politely excuse myself or change the subject.
Exactly. When you don't participate, you're sending a message.
Hmm.
You're not interested in that negativity. And it protects you
Mhm.
because when the truth comes out, you won't be in the middle of it.
Right, right. It's like, don't feed the trolls, Ignore them and they'll eventually get bored and move on.
Exactly. And remember, gossiping just creates a toxic environment. It can ruin relationships. When you refuse to participate, you're actually setting a good example, promoting a more respectful workplace.
Okay, I'm definitely trying that ignore strategy next time. But what about the negative Nancys out there? The people who just, everything is bad, the glass is always half empty.
Yeah, yes. The chronic complainers. It's tempting to try and cheer them up or offer solutions, but the source recommends a different approach. Boundaries.
Boundaries. So if someone's just like spiraling into negativity, I should just interrupt and say something like, look, I get it, you're frustrated, but I'm trying to stay positive right now.
Yeah, you could say something like that. Or you could try, I understand you're feeling frustrated, but I'm focusing on staying positive right now. Maybe we can chat later. It's acknowledging their feelings, but also protecting your own energy.
It's like having a shield to deflect that negativity. You're not responsible for absorbing everyone else's bad vibes.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of boundaries, let's shift gears a bit and talk about navigating challenging relationships with our superiors. Because when it's your boss exhibiting these behaviors, the stakes are higher.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other level. I mean, it's one thing to, disagree with a coworker, but how do you handle a difficult boss?
Well, the source acknowledges that this can be really, really tough, but it does offer strategies for different types of bosses. Let's start with the verbally abusive boss, the one who uses fear and intimidation.
Oh, man. I've heard stories about bosses who just yell and belittle their employees. That's just unacceptable. What does the source say to do in that situation?
First things first, document everything. Dates, times, specific examples of the behavior, who else was there. Keep a detailed record.
So, like, if my boss screams at me in a meeting, I should write down exactly what was said, when it happened, and who witnessed it.
Exactly. That creates a paper trail. If
Ah,
you ever need to go to HR or take legal action,
okay, that makes sense. But what about addressing it directly? Should I confront my boss about their behavior?
that's where you have to be careful. The source says to really assess the risks. If your boss has a history of retaliating, it might be safer to just focus on documenting everything and getting support from HR or a mentor.
Right, so it's a balance. Standing up for yourself, but also protecting yourself.
Exactly. And that same careful approach applies to another challenging boss, the dictator, the one who wants to control everything and demands total
Oh,
obedience.
the micromanagers, they want to control everything. Down to the font you use in an email. So suffocating. How do you get some breathing room with a boss like that?
The source actually suggests starting with compliance. Pick your battles. Try to meet their demands, especially at the beginning.
So don't fight over every little detail. Just go with the flow and keep the peace.
Right, but at the same time, start documenting. Keep track of when their controlling behavior is actually hurting your work or creating a toxic environment.
So, like, if my boss insists on approving every single email I send, even if it's just a routine update, I should document how much time that's adding to my workload.
Exactly. That documentation will be important if you need to talk to them about their management style or go to HR.
Okay, so compliance and documentation for the dictator boss. But what about the opposite problem? What if you have a boss who is totally incompetent, just making mistakes left and right?
This is where it gets interesting. Instead of just complaining about them, the source suggests trying to help them improve.
Wait, so I should mentor my boss? That seems a little backwards.
It might seem counterintuitive, but think about it. When you help your boss succeed, you're also showing off your own leadership skills. Plus, it can help you build a better working relationship with them.
Okay, so like if my boss can't manage their time, I could offer some tips or tools that have worked for me.
Exactly. Or if they're struggling with a project, maybe help them brainstorm solutions or connect them with resources.
I see what you mean. By being proactive and supporting my boss's development, I'm also creating a better work environment for myself.
Right, and it shows you're committed to the team, which can only help you in the long run.
Wow, this deep dive is really changing how I think about dealing with bosses. It's like these challenges are opportunities for growth for me and my boss.
That's a great point,
hmm
which leads us to maybe the most delicate boss archetype, the unethical one.
Oh, that's a tough one. What do you do when your boss is doing something shady, maybe even illegal? That's a whole other level of complicated.
It is, it really is. The source has some advice for this situation, and it's nuanced. But like always, the first step is to document everything.
So if I suspect my boss is like cooking the books, I should be gathering evidence, emails, invoices, anything I can find.
Exactly. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case will be if you have to report them. And speaking of reporting, the source is very clear on this point. You have the right to refuse to do anything that goes against your own ethics.
So even if my boss tells me to do something I think is wrong, I can say no.
Yes, absolutely. You never have to compromise your integrity, even if it means risking your job.
Wow, that's important to remember. But what if saying no isn't enough? What if the ethical violations are really serious and need to be reported?
If you decide to be a whistleblower, the source says, proceed with caution. Make sure you have solid evidence and be prepared for potential backlash.
So it's not a decision to make lightly. Whistleblowing can have serious consequences.
Exactly. Weigh the risks and benefits carefully. And get legal advice if you need to.
This has been so helpful. I feel much more prepared to handle difficult situations. But before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge that not all bosses are bad. I've been lucky to have some amazing mentors.
Oh, absolutely. And this deep dive is just about navigating those tough situations. There are plenty of great leaders out there who inspire their teams and are supportive.
Right. And if you're lucky enough to have a great boss, cherish them. They're a rare find.
You said it. Okay, we've covered a lot today, from basic communication skills to dealing with those challenging coworkers and bosses. I'm curious, what are some key takeaways for you from all of this?
You know, what really stands out to me is that good communication isn't just about like knowing a bunch of tricks. It's about really getting how people interact, being able to adapt to different personalities, and always trying to improve our own skills.
I agree. It's definitely something you work on your whole life. You're always learning and, practicing.
Exactly. And what I love about this deep dive is that it gives us so many practical strategies, like things we can actually start using today, from the basics like I statements and apologizing strategically to the more, complex stuff like dealing with difficult coworkers and bosses.
Yeah, I think there's something here for everyone. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is how important self-awareness and emotional intelligence are. The more we understand ourselves, our own triggers and communication style and how we affect others, the better we can navigate all these situations.
Right. It's like becoming a more mindful communicator, being present in the moment, making good choices about how to react when things get tough.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something else the source talked about. Boundaries. Whether you're dealing with a gossipy coworker or a negative Nancy or even a verbally abusive boss, setting those boundaries is so important for protecting yourself and creating a more positive environment.
Totally. Boundaries are like those invisible shields,
Right.
right? That keep the negativity and drama out. And you don't need any special powers to create them.
Right. It's just about knowing what you're willing to put up with and communicating those limits
Uh-huh.
clearly, but respectfully.
This has been, like, eye-opening for me. I feel so much more confident about dealing with these situations. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something they can really dig into and apply to their own situation.
Ooh, I like it. What kind of question are you going to leave them with?
Okay, listener, here's your challenge for the week. Think about a recent interaction at work that just left you feeling bad, maybe frustrated, drained, or like you weren't heard. Now imagine you could go back to that conversation and use one of the strategies we talked about today. How would you do things differently? What would you say? How would you act? Would you set a boundary?
That's a great challenge. Just thinking about those conversations differently and trying out these strategies can really change the way you communicate and hopefully lead to better outcomes.
And remember, even small changes can make a big difference, not just for you, but for everyone around you.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture of respect where everyone feels safe to communicate openly and honestly.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of workplace communication. Thanks for joining us today and happy communicating.